This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us on site and online. My name is Antonia Zimmermann. I'm a sustainability reporter for Politico. The global race is on to secure the materials needed for green transition technologies, from electric vehicle batteries to wind turbines and solar panels. Now, the challenge is for the EU to diversify its supply away from Russia and China. And to rise up to that challenge, the European Commission is currently working on its Critical Raw Materials Act, which we're expecting in the spring, but which is already raising a number of questions that I'm very excited to discuss with you today. Before we start, just a few housekeeping remarks. You can please submit your questions through the Swapcard platform. I know you've heard this multiple times now, but you can find the instructions on our event website. If you're already on the platform, feel free to engage with other participants and to submit your questions on the right side of your desktop or underneath the live stream if you're following us on a mobile phone. And if you're in the room, please feel free to also submit your questions on the platform by scanning the QR codes that you can find in the room. Before we jump into today's discussion, I would now like to give the floor to Stefan de Bruyn. He is Business Development Director at SQM for his opening remarks. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and good morning, everybody. I'd like to start off by thanking Politico for organizing such a great event. For those of you who are not familiar with SQM, we are a Chilean chemical and mining company. We produce about 20% of the world's lithium chemicals today, which are in all of your batteries of your mobile, smartphones, laptops, and hopefully EVs. Besides that, we're also a global leader in iodine and natural nitrates. But today, we're here to talk about lithium. So I'd like to start off with a very personal memory of mine. So I'd like to take you back to 2008, where I landed in a commercial role in Beijing in what initially appeared to be a very dense fog. It was only when I got out of the airport that I got like a sting in my eyes and an acidic taste in my mouth that I realized that for the first time in my life I was experiencing highly polluted air. I became an environmentalist overnight. So it's really exciting to see today that EVs are really taking off, and that's thanks to a combination of regulatory incentives and something which is often forgotten, consumer enthusiasm. But it's important that in this transition towards a more sustainable economy, it's important that we do this in the right way, in a sustainable way, in an equitable way. Before that even, I mean, it's plain for everybody to see that we cannot continue to burn fossil fuels, because that generates just heat, which you can use only once, and CO2. The batteries in the EVs and in your laptops have the potential to be recycled. The Commission is actively working on that, and industry is working on that globally. Actually, they are already being recycled. There's just not enough batteries for the recyclers to process today. So that is very exciting to see. Now, when we look at the raw materials, and specifically at SQM, our ambition is to be the most sustainable lithium producer in the world. And we believe we have the right attributes to achieve that ambition. Today, already, the lithium produced in the north of Chile and Salar de Atacama, it has the lowest carbon footprint, energy footprint, and also water footprint according to life cycle assessment methodology. Don't take my word for it. This was calculated by Argonne National Lab and published in a peer-reviewed paper. Based on that LCA, we have been able to identify the levers to decide our plan towards carbon neutral lithium production in 2030. And at the same time, we are quadrupling our refining capacity in the north of Chile between 2018 and 2023. And we're also reducing our brine extractions and our freshwater extractions. Brine by 20% with the goal to reach minus 50% by 2030. Freshwater extractions, we're already down 50%. What is really exciting is if you look at our brine and water consumption per ton produced, in the last 2 years, since we presented our Sustainable Development Plan, we have reduced 60%. And the potential to go further is there. We just presented actually our innovation roadmap for water neutral lithium production in Salar de Atacama, based on a combination of advanced evaporation technology, direct lithium extraction, seawater reduction, and desalination plant. That's about SQM and what we are doing. It's not only about SQM, it's also about the stakeholders of our operation in the north of Chile, in Chile, and globally. The value sharing from the lithium in Chile is the highest of any lithium produced in the world today. For SQM, provided that in Q4 we can match the commercial performance of Q3, we are on target to share $5 billion, that's with the B of Barcelona, with the government, the regional authorities, the community of San Pedro de Atacama, also communities and R&D. So that's highly significant value sharing. Of course, our responsibility doesn't stop there. We need to be held accountable. So the Salar de Atacama mining operation of SQM was one of the first 5 mining sites in the world to go through an on-site audit of IRMA. IRMA is probably the most robust and most comprehensive mining assurance standard in the world. Okay, so we come back now to the EVs. If you look at the EVs this year, we're going to hit an important milestone. Probably 10 million, more than 10 million EVs are going to be sold in the world today, and that is a 13% share of the car sales globally. So that's very exciting. I think 15 years ago when I landed in Beijing, this was almost unimaginable. So when you see this potential for technology, innovation, drive and optimism, we really have to believe that we can make a better world before we can make it. So it's with great pleasure that I can announce a very esteemed panel who will discuss about the challenges of the EV value chain from a European perspective. Thank you very much.
Please, after you. Thank you very much. I would now like to give a very warm welcome to our panelists with us here today. Henrike Hahn, a member of the European Parliament for the German Greens. Peter Handley, he is head of unit for energy-intensive industries and raw materials at DG GROW at the European Commission. And as far as I'm aware, the only person on this panel today who's not German. And Michael Schmidt, an economic geologist with the German Resources Agency, who has been nominated by SQM. To kick off today's discussion, I would like to start with a question to you, Peter. Commission President has made it very clear that the Critical Raw Materials Act is about ramping up reserves within the bloc. And one of the main ideas that we've heard and that we've discussed is the idea of designating projects of strategic interest, which would benefit from additional funding, faster permitting. Could you tell us a bit more on how these projects might be selected?
Yes, I'm happy to. I think what I should start off by saying is that the word strategic is quite overused at the moment, but what we're trying to do is really of strategic, if not geostrategic importance, because, as my president has said, it doesn't make any kind of sense that for all the really important things that we want to achieve as Europe, we are so dependent on one or two suppliers for the things that make that possible. And so that's the first use of strategic. We're going to be identifying the things which we will need to make the products, the green technologies that are our pathway to achieve Paris Agreement goals. And the idea is that we're going to identify materials that are of strategic importance and then projects. And these projects will be across the value chain. People tend to think this is largely about mining. It's absolutely not all about mining. It's about really looking at making sure we have the capacity to refine and process metals, and we're good at that. But so much of the world's refining takes place in China at the moment. And it's also about recycling. And where you say recycling and refining, it's often the same kind of companies that do that stuff. That's crucial. We also want to recover materials from mining waste, brownfield sites. And we want to look at where it makes sense to do mining in Europe. And if we do mine in Europe, we want to make sure that the case is made that we can do it really sustainably and in a way that is very respectful and involves the communities and local authorities.
Yeah, I will want to get back to this notion of also identifying minerals of strategic interest in a moment. But I think one of the main concerns that's often been raised by NGOs as well is what you've just mentioned, right? How do you identify these projects of strategic interest, make sure the permitting is sped up, but also at the same time make sure that environmental protection is safeguarded. So what are you planning to make sure these two don't come into conflict in that context? So
essentially we're planning to make use of the same kind of framework that was developed on the energy side for the projects of common interest. That means that we'll have a process of projects being put forward and then being scrutinized in detail to make sure that they hit the highest environmental, social and governance standards, that the numbers stack up, that they are indeed corresponding to a real strategic need. Then there'll be a decision-making role for the Commission and also then a role for the co-legislators through delegated acts. So there would be a properly designed process to make sure that only the best projects get through.
Let me put that to you, Henrike. From what you've just heard, is that sufficient from your perspective to make sure ramping up these projects within the bloc doesn't harm the environment? And what kind of provisions do you think are needed in the Act to make sure we reconcile these two aims?
So first of all, I think it's very clear that in the context of the Green Deal, for real change, we need critical raw materials in Europe. And of course, we have a different setting now with the war in Europe and all the challenges correlated to that for our industry that we would like to green, of course, in Europe. First of all, we need a green industrial strategy, and we also need a green critical raw material strategy. And we will work on that next year in March. And of course, I mean, we all know that the term sustainable mining is a little a contradiction in itself, even if we also know, of course, there are lots of companies really taking care of that, and we all also on the EU side really work in that direction that mining can happen only in a sustainable way, but there are limits, of course. It means that we have to be very cautious when we call, for example, like the Commission does currently still, that we call for more mining in Europe, because first of all, we have to calculate very specifically our demand, what kind of critical raw materials do we need, and how much do we need in the future? Where do we get it from? And then as a second point that is of course very important, we have to also focus on a second strategy in a way that we not only focus on mining, but also on things like substitution, circular economy, of course, and research and development, of course, as an additional part that we need to get alternatives. And we also need a secondary market for raw materials, of course, and means like this pathway has to be included as well when we work on critical raw materials, because we all know that the environment and the social implications are very severe also in Europe, and we have, of course, a European public that has a tendency also to be against mining in Europe. It's not only, we can't say it's not only the topic of not in my backyard. I think it's a real problem we are facing with mining. So we have to be very careful not to do mining, for example, in protected areas in Europe. It means like not in Natura 2000 areas, and also, to implement the Green Deal at the same time. So we have to take pragmatic decisions at the one hand, and on the other hand, we have to take decisions that also have in mind a long-term perspective, how we want to make the green industry competitive, but also green at the same time. And then we have to take that into account too.
Let me now get to you, Michael. Henrike already mentioned the issue of, local resistance and obstacles that we face when we, as we try to ramp up production within Europe. Are there, what are your thoughts on this based on your experience in Germany? And are there also any examples that you might be able to provide from Germany on, how you're navigating this in your agency?
I think one of the biggest issues is that we have a communications problem. And what I mean by saying that is we are on a path away from fossil fuel driven economies towards renewable energies, electric cars, solar and wind energy. This transition will require a 4 to 6-fold increase in mine production for these technologies. As an example, if you want to produce 1 gigawatt hours of electricity from coal-fired power plants, you would need a raw material cube of 5 tons, all included. If you want to produce the same amount of energy from wind and solar, you need 19 tons. Another number that I would like to throw at you is if we all want to be using electric vehicles, the raw materials required for that, lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, aluminum, would mean that by 2030 or 2035, we need 300 to 400 additional mining operations globally to supply that amount of material so that we can get this transition going. So we need to communicate towards the civil society, to ourselves, that if we want this transition, we will require additional raw materials. And we need to do that in the most sustainable way possible. And for doing that, we need to find a definition, what is the most sustainable way of producing raw materials? Mr. De Bruyn already said that lithium production in Chile, for example, is right now the most sustainable way of producing lithium. Is it as it is right now, but is it really the most sustainable production in a global sense? And that applies also for graphite, nickel, cobalt, and all the other battery raw materials that we have. And when you look at Europe, Europe could be self-sufficient to a certain extent in these raw materials. Lithium, for example, 15 to 20%. Everything else will be import dependent from other countries. And the same with cobalt and nickel. Europe has 1% of global cobalt production, 1% of global graphite production, and 3% of global nickel production. But these are all materials that we need for this transition.
And just to get back to my initial question, is there any, example of projects in Germany where you would say, they have great potential, but currently this is, local resistance is one of the main obstacles?
The question is what you define as local opposition. Yes, we do have raw material projects in Germany on the lithium side, but in other raw materials as well. But I cannot pinpoint a certain project because, but yes, there is local opposition towards mining. Yes, because we have lost our feeling for mining in Germany 30 years ago. There is no metal mining in Germany anymore, so there's no skills, and the recognition for that need for that industry is not there anymore. And that's different in other countries in Europe, for example. It's different in Finland and in France and other countries. But Germany is a very specific case in that sense. Yes.
Peter, when you hear that, when you hear these concerns from different countries, and also, as we have to say, stark differences between countries where they're currently at in their experience with mining and their mining history, what do you think is needed to, what are your selling points, and how do you think the communication needs to change, and how do you seek to address also concerns that will inevitably come up from different countries?
Well, I think the European Commission is not the best person to be reaching out directly to the public because we are quite removed and we're seen as quite removed. But I think it's the role of elected politicians really to take the debate out on, in their constituencies and try to explain, well, if you want to shift away from fossil fuels, it means you need different technologies, and those technologies mean you need materials and you need people with the skills. And also, I think we get people to understand that Europe is a very, very big consuming region of the world, but we don't really take our responsibilities because a lot of our emissions are invisible to us because they're taking place in developing countries, right? So it's a bit of a blind spot, and I think people should become more aware of that. But we've also been listening to what Ms. Hahn and her colleagues have been saying. Don't just throw numbers at us about you need X times more lithium, Y times more cobalt. Prove it. And actually what we're doing in our impact assessment is we're trying to see how can we reduce demand and still achieve our objectives. And I'm talking about things like, well, behavioral changes in the way the economy is run. To what extent can these apply? It's more easy to apply probably in the field of electric vehicles because does everyone need to have a big 2-ton electric vehicle? No. But in the case of renewables, we're probably harder to suppress the amount of energy that's going to be needed. So we do need more hydrogen, we do need more wind, we do need more solar and heat pumps and things like that.
Yes.
If I just may add to this, and thank you that you pointed it out. Everybody or the whole industry is talking about sustainable mining, which is totally correct. But I'm missing a discussion about sustainable use of materials. Like, how long do we use a product? Do we need a 2.5-ton electric SUV? No, we don't. With the same amount of raw materials you could produce 4 smaller cars. And by doing that, you not transport 1 person, but 4. And then you start funny things like car sharing. You transport 8 people with the same amount of materials. And then you don't use a product for 1 year or 5 years, but longer. But that contradicts, unfortunately, the way the world runs. But this is a very important question that we need to ask. If we have these demand scenarios on the horizon, we need to change the behavior and use less. But this is difficult.
I could jump into that. Of course, thank you very much for these interesting thoughts. I think, of course, we can also think of the responsibility of the consumers, but of course it's our job to to work in a way that also the industry producing takes several aspects into account, and so it's on us also to decide, of course. And I'm very happy to hear that the Commission also, because we had a lot of discussions already working in the ITRE on the critical raw materials already, that we as political actors also take into account what the industry is doing automatically, right? Because the industry really knows their demand of raw materials in the future, for example. And we have the same kind of discussion at the moment on the CHIPS Act I currently work on, which is, of course, raw material affiliated as well. How can be a political actor quicker to react on the industry needs, right? On the other hand, we have to rise the environmental and social standards in Europe. It's still too less. I mean, it's old stuff somehow we refer to, right? And we really have to be updated there, and to bring all these aspects together and to be very precise and to learn from the industry the speed somehow. On the other hand, we have democratic process. We have really to exchange our views and to discuss all these kind of things, because we have what we decide as on a legislative file has huge implications, of course. And just to keep in mind, the Green Deal was the big issue for this legislative period. So we decided that every legislative file has to have the Green Deal in its core. And so because at the moment we see a kind of shift, a challenge of the Green Deal from the Commission side as well as from other groups in the Parliament, and we really have to fight for that, to think in a long-term perspective, to make the industry competitive even more than ever before, because they are really confronted with challenges like the energy crisis, and on the other hand to have a competition strategy that works also with the Green Deal together, and this is what we have to work on.
And one of the in the feedback that you've received so far in the Act, the idea of reducing demand and making that a part of the Act has been, it's coming up quite a lot, especially in feedback submitted from NGOs. And some groups even advocate for an overall EU-wide material footprint reduction target to be a part of the Act. Maybe you first, Peter, is that something that you're considering?
Well, excuse me. We're considering a lot of things at the moment because we're preparing an impact assessment to accompany our regulatory proposal. And we're looking very much at the whole circularity, resource efficiency side of things, as well as the mismatch between the supply and demand. This idea of having an overarching single number for resource use has been kicking around for a while, including in the last mandate. But I can't answer precisely, will we be proposing that specific option? But we're definitely looking at a range of different possibilities in that particular sort of space about how we can be as resource efficient as possible.
Would you like to jump in? Is that something that you'd like to see in the Act?
Well, I mean, there are lots of instruments we have to reconsider, of course. I mean, we have developed some tools already working on the critical raw material strategy. And of course, now in the new context, we have to reconsider as well. I mean, we just have the discussion on the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. That is very interesting, of course, with the consequences for raw materials, for chips, for the European industry itself. And so let's see what happens if this will have an effect as well on the critical raw material file, because on the one hand, it's very clear that this, for us, the United States is a very huge, important partner, right? And of course, WTO can, in a long-term perspective, discuss these issues, but it won't be a solution for the European industry. We need quick solutions for that. But it means as well that we might consider additionally, of course, to have more cooperation on an international level, like the EU has, for example, with Canada at the moment on raw materials, and to widen that aspect, to make it efficient, because actually it's very clear that climate protection can only be solved together, this challenge. And on the other hand, we need a real competitive industry on both sides of the Atlantic. So this would be an additional aspect we could see, for example, in the new legislative file, but we still have to discuss that, of course.
I would like to come back to one of the words that you just, one of the key terms in this debate, self-sufficiency, that you've brought up, and I think that also ties into this notion of, well, how might, the Inflation Reduction Act, well, how do we respond to that? And the Commission has also floated introducing targets for the European value chain. And I think what's mostly, been discussed here is some supplying up to 30% of some of the materials that we need. I'm wondering, are these targets that you, Peter, are considering to apply to all 30 raw materials that are currently deemed critical? Or do you think some kind of ranking prioritization might be needed there?
Well, first of all, we are definitely considering the option about setting targets for a degree of self-sufficiency, but we're not talking about achieving the impossible and saying that Europe is going to be fully self-sufficient for everything. It's not possible, and it's not sensible or desirable. But we are looking very much at what does it make sense to aim for in terms of, let's say, lithium refining capacity or nickel recycling capabilities. So we'll be looking at a value chain approach. Will we set targets for everything at every stage? Possibly not. We need a few headline figures, but we need to send signals about direction of travel so that the market knows where we think it's very, very important to invest.
Michael, what's your thought on that?
a very generic thought is the more that we can supply from within Europe, the better on any raw material. I think it will be very challenging for all of those raw materials on the list to reach a certain level of self-sufficiency simply because we don't have them in Europe. Now there's two ways to look at self-sufficiency. The first one is you want to source it from within Europe primarily. That's going to be difficult, as I said, lithium 15 to 25%. Or the second way could be have a German or European companies to be in other countries like Namibia, Chile, Argentina, and provide subsidiaries here in Europe so that you'd have a European source because the company is from Europe. So these are two ways of looking at self-sufficiency. I would like to see both happening. Unfortunately, our industry is very, very risk adverse. They don't want to take the risk. There's sort of in auto insurance, you would say they all want to have full coverage for the risk. So risk is not on their top priority list. That's what the Chinese are doing very, very well. The Americans are starting to do that. So we need to come up with a strategy to either be self-sufficient out of Europe, and if that is not possible, our industry needs to go on a bilateral level, if possible, to countries with those raw materials, and do it there, but the right way. So that would be a thought on that one.
And would you?
No, I just want to jump in there because actually what we are doing is we are negotiating strategic partnerships with countries. We have them with Canada, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Namibia. We're starting with Greenland and Norway at the moment, and there will be others in Africa and Latin America. And what we do is we're trying to go better than just having an individual car company or an individual member state engaging with that country. We're trying to bring a Team Europe approach so we can really bring a coherent thing. And what we bring as a value proposition is we're not here just to take what rocks you pull out of the ground. We want to help you do the processing and refining and the recycling, add value in your country and raise your environmental, social and governance so that what comes into the European economy we can feel good about, right?
And that is something that, from all the trips that I've done over the past years, is something that is going to be requested from those raw material-rich countries. They want this European approach. They want education. They don't want pure extractivism. They want education. They want downstream industries. They want added value in the countries. And I think that is something that a Team Europe approach, this is exactly what we can do, which other competitors are not willing to do. So,
please.
I think that strategic partnerships are relevant and important as well. And on the other hand, we also have to take into account, for example, like when there's industry affiliated to the European industry, that the profit from that really stays in the country itself as well, right? I mean, because the people, the landscape, the damage of the landscape and how it affects the people, you know, where mining is done, they also have to profit from that. So this really we have to take into account, as well as when we buy material in Europe, when we buy raw material, that while during the buying process, we consider already the environmental and social standards if they're implemented, and here we can do a lot. And I think, of course, it would be like too much dreaming of, right, that we can be autonomous in Europe with all the critical raw materials we currently need or probably in the future need. But there are solutions we have to consider, and I think a strategic project, because we talked about it at the very beginning, can only be strategic for the European Union if environmental and social standards are met, the highest possible standards are met, and so this is what we have to focus on. Yeah.
Just two short thoughts on that. I think
very short, please.
One of the very important value propositions from Europe is that we can show other countries how we can redeem old mining sites. That is something that we can do very, very well. So I'll cut it to that one.
Thank you. Yeah, there's just one last point I wanted to get to, and that's the notion of, and I think you've mentioned it right at the beginning, that when you speak to stakeholders, there's great interest in maybe not only focusing on materials that are deemed critical by the current definition that we're using, but materials that are strategic, right, that we will need for the green transition. I'm wondering, what kind of role do you think they should play in this act? Maybe let's start with you, Henrike.
You mean like, of course we have, some material will be very relevant in the future for us. And of course we have also now a different setting as well. You know, we currently consider that as well on the CHIPS Act 2, which is affiliated again to raw materials, you know, what kind of chips we need in the future, which is relevant is not only for the industry, but maybe also for space and defense industry, for the security of a region, right? And this might affect as well the raw material demand. We have to be very specific with the calculation, what will be critical raw materials in the future as well, and have to be wise in our decisions on that.
Please, to say something?
Yes.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've presented in our call for evidence is that we're developing the concept of strategic materials, because we have a criticality method, but that's about numbers. It's about combining the figures which tell you what is of most economic importance for your economy and where there's the greatest supply risk. We also look at substitution, innovation, how dependent we are on single sources of supply, and the level of governance and ESG in supplier countries. But it's essentially looking at data from the past. And what is missing is the forward-looking dimension. We're going to produce another foresight report looking at what are the materials we'll need for the key strategic technologies we've said we're going to push hard on. Hydrogen, wind, solar, electric vehicles, heat pumps, that kind of thing, which generally coincide with what we need to do for the digital. So what we need for chips is also very strategic. And let's not forget defense and aerospace, right? We have basically to look at the word strategic materials in the context of being a more political choice based on the technologies that we have said as Europe we are going to be accelerating the implementation of.
And how do you see that play out also with, you know, obviously different countries will have different interests based on what kind of resources they have within their borders. How do you, is that something that you're concerned about, or is that something that can be, you know, easily solved, saying that you're working on this approach and that definition will kind of guide the work?
So first of all, we're collecting what everyone thinks, and many of the member states, NGOs, businesses, and even third countries have been giving us feedback on what they think strategic materials should be. So we're going to stir the pot, see what that looks like, and we'll make a proposal probably before the end of March. And then it's in the hands of the colleagues in the European Parliament and the Council to make of it what they will. But we hope that we will get a very good piece of legislation through before the end of this political cycle.
Michael, are there any materials that are currently not deemed critical that you think should definitely have a space in this act?
Well, first of all, I don't like to call those materials critical, but potentially critical, because nobody knows what the demand is going to be for X, Y, and Z in 5 or 10 years. I've been working in lithium, and I'd be afraid to tell you what the market's going to look like in 2 to 3 years, because this world has become so dynamic. We're going away from a supply-demand-driven economy towards a more geopolitical-driven world. So there's other new aspects that will come into play that you need to put into the calculation for your demand scenarios. So it'd be very hard to give an estimate on what's going to be potentially critical in a couple of years' time. We monitor about 80 to 90 potentially critical raw materials for different technologies. We have a lot of people that have insight into these technologies. And then as we are subordinate to the Ministry of Economics, for example, we just give that information and feedback back to our government, and then they have to, on a political level, make decisions and set the pathway, the regulatory frameworks, so that the industry can thrive and survive.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're very close to the end, and I would just like to end with one single question. A few words on what is one thing that you think is needed to make the Critical Raw Materials Act a success. Let's start with you, Henrike.
First of all, it has to be recognized that we need critical raw materials for the implementation of the Green Deal. We need a very specific calculation of the future demand, and we need additional pathways with all our energy as well to work on that for substitution, circular economy, and research and development, because this is an essential key, and we really, in all groups in the European Parliament, we fight for that research and development is considered also in the next EU budget 2024, because we currently worked on 2023, in a way that there's lots of weight on research and development on the European side as well, to work on that, as it was just mentioned, because we really need to develop new technologies and to be as much as efficient as well, like lithium is a very good example for that, and then we have to consider that and as well implement it in the Critical Raw Act next year.
Yeah, I'd say two things. I would hope that there is a genuine realization that we have to take more responsibility for the materials that we're using in Europe, and we should make much better use of the potential we have to source these things inside Europe. And that largely is looking at the recovery and recycling, the refining, but also where necessary, the mining. And the other thing is, we desperately need to be much more agile in terms of making sure that the investments take place along the value chain that keep our capacity to move towards these green and resilient technologies, rather than have all these investments move to the United States simply because they've got lots of federal money to throw at the problem, instead of policies, I would say.
And please, Michael.
Well, overall recognition, realistic approaches, communication between politicians, the industry, NGOs, SCOs, and a clear legal regulatory framework that will enable the industry to take risk on their own, because you need to start walking before you can ride a bicycle. So the industry needs some support, yes, but they need to start to take risk on their own, and politicians can only guide them. So,
well, we're very close to the end of our session, but thank you very much for this discussion and for sharing your thoughts. I'm sure there's very interesting times ahead of us. Our circular economy segment of this day is now almost coming to an end, and so I would warmly like to thank my panelists as well as everyone who joined us online and on site. I would also like to thank our partners who make this event possible, our leading partners, Coca-Cola in Europe, GE, SQM, our presenting partners, Braskem, Cefic, Google, MAN Truck and Bus, Ørsted, PepsiCo, and PGE, and our networking partners, Casey and 3M. We're now moving to an on-site segment of today, and you can choose and join your preferred roundtable upstairs before we break for lunch. The roundtable on fast fashion, moderated by my colleague Leonie Cater, is taking place in Salon Rose. You can join my colleague Louise Guillot for a roundtable on nature restoration in Salon Bleu. And if you want to join me for a roundtable on air pollution, then please go to the Salon Petite Mérode. And for everyone joining us online, we will resume at 2:15 with the segment Fast Tracking Green Mobility, with a panel discussion on e-mobility, the charging challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.